presidential candidate, Mr. Deon D. Jenkins, the hip hop president, and yes, a black man running on reparations. Is that safe? We have a lot of questions, so without further ado, let me get Mr. Jenkins on. How are you doing this evening, Mr. Jenkins?
Oh, man, I'm doing very well. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for showing up. Hey, because we done had a few interviews, and once people get the kind of understanding, get the understanding of the topics that we cover and the questions that we ask, they tend not to show up to the actual show. So I give you kudos for that, first and foremost. This will not be easy. I must say that up front. I think tonight will kind of, it's going to be rough, Mr. Jenkins. It's going to be rough. But I know we got my brother, Raz. First of all, hold on. I didn't even introduce the show because I'm so excited about this conversation tonight. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Real Life, the radio show. I am your host, Jenna Capra, alongside my partner, my brother Raz. And again, our special guest, Deon D. Jenkins, presidential candidate. Brother Raz, you have anything you want to say before we get into this beautiful conversation tonight?
Sure. Thank you, Brother Deon D. Jenkins, just for being with us. We greatly appreciate you being with us. When my partner says that the question, or it's going to be a hard show, it's not in the sense of how we're going to approach you. So it's going to be very respectful and courteous. It's just we just have a lot of questions about a lot of things, just because of what Black people in America have been through up to this point. And
yes, sir.
Black people are at a place in space where they need change, and they need change like yesterday. It's no longer like Tupac used to say, we asked with the Panthers and all of those folks. We want what we want, and we want it now. So now that we're hearing about your approach, I think this is going to be refreshing to hear. And and because your approach is so different, drastically different from any other presidential candidate that I know of, I think that's where the hardness is going to come, because people just want to get those questions answered and get to know you better in a way where they'll be able to better understand first and then resonate with the message that you have and the direction you're trying to take the country in with your candidacy. So with that, I would just love to have you pretty much introduce yourself to the people, for anyone who may not know who you are, may not be as familiar with you. And from there, we'll be able to, I think we can pretty much move forward from there, unless you have any questions before we get started.
Oh, not at all. My name is Deon D. Jenkins. I'm a presidential candidate. I am a Democratic candidate. However, I'm not loyal to the Democratic Party, and I'm going to explain that. And I believe, it's not what I believe, it's facts, that it's a two-party system, Democrat and Republican. If we're going to get to the White House, we're going to have to go through one of those parties. In this era, it's a two-party system. Maybe in 50 years it'll change, but right now, in the era, in the climate that we live in the universe, in the dimension that we live in, we're going to have to either infiltrate one of those two parties or just take it over. And I come with a process that I like to call, we're going to hijack the vote. Never before in the history of, I take that back. Never before in our history, since we've been alive, have we had a candidate who was a Black agenda priority candidate. I first ran back in 2015 as a grassroots hip hop organizer. I'm a hip hop artist. I'm not a celebrity rapper. I'm a grassroots hip hop organizer. Big difference. And I was just an individual who said there have to be change. I saw the Barack Obama presidency, how it lasted. Unfortunately, I did vote for Barack Obama the first time off of the idea that there was going to be change, right? I even printed some T-shirts. I was in the streets. I sold like thousands of T-shirts, making a lot of money off of Barack Obama T-shirts, mixtapes, and CDs that I was recording back then, and it was because of guys like me, unfortunately, who gave Barack Obama street credibility and made black people, embrace him on a credible level. However, I was a lot younger at the time. I was a lot uneducated, more uneducated than I am now. I saw a black man at the highest level, and I said, yes, finally. You know what I'm saying? And we see how that panned out. 8 years later, the racial wealth gap widened. There is a study done by the Institute of Policy Studies that states that by 2053, the black household income is going to be $0. All right. Not only that, but there was a study back in 2006 stated by the FBI that said that white extremist groups were infiltrating law enforcement. There's another study that stated between 2008 and 2014, white extremist groups rose from 149 to over 1,000 groups. And we are seeing the results of that era. So I, as a hip hop artist, decided that there was something that had to be done. And I began studying, doing a lot of research. And this was before Barack Obama's first campaign, his first election cycle, before it ended. I started doing a lot of research, a lot of reading, a lot of studying, figuring out ways how to change the system. And I kept stumbling across the same type of scenario. I kept stumbling upon the presidency. And at the time, I was like, oh, man, that's a pipe dream. I can't be a president. I'm a hip hop artist. And then I started doing more research. And then a light bulb came on. I said, what if I could galvanize the people for this? And I still did not have all of the answers at the time. However, I knew that I need to infiltrate elected offices in some way, shape, or form. But I knew that the presidential office was the highest level, but I really wasn't really educated on the powers that it had. And then I found out that the president was commander-in-chief. And I said, wow, if I infiltrate the highest level of elected offices, I would be the highest status member in the military. And that was related to my plan because I was there. I live in the Bay Area. And when Oscar Grant got shot down, I was out here. And I remember when that happened. And it affected me and a lot of other people a lot. And for those of you who do not know who Oscar Grant is, he was a young man who was gunned down back on New Year's Day in 2009. He was catching the BART, and there was video footage of him being shot in the back in handcuffs by a BART police officer. And it sent shockwaves across the country. They even made a movie about it later on, played by Michael B. Jordan, and the movie is called Fruitvale, in reference to the station where Oscar Grant was killed. So I saw the white extremism happening, and I saw where it was trending, and being out in the streets, I saw people talking. I would come across against white supremacists on the streets when I would try to approach them and sell my mixtapes and stuff like that. And sometimes I would get in squabbles on the streets with white supremacists, with white extremists about racial stuff. And I saw that this was something that was serious, and if nobody did anything about it, something bad was going to happen to our people. And as I began to study, I saw that the current president at the time wasn't doing nothing about it. Then what really set it off was when Freddie Gray was killed, and Baltimore got shook up, and the president at the time, Barack Obama, made a statement that really rubbed me the wrong way. He called the people who was resisting thugs. He called them thugs, and he sent out the National Guard. And in my mind, I'm thinking, as a black man, the president of the United States of America going to use the military. He is the highest, because by this time I was educated enough to know his power. The president, the only absolute power that the president has, and we saw this with George Bush very well, and we saw this with his father, George H.W. Bush. The only absolute power that the president has is the power of military. You can either use that National Guard for the people or against the people. And in that situation, those people were protesting and was resisting. They were resisting and using their 14th Amendment right to resist tyranny in America. And the president at the time decided to use the military, to use his highest level of office as a way to use it against the people, particularly black people. And that really rubbed me. At that moment, I said, I'm going to be president, because something has to be done. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but we're going to figure it out. So I became really focused on finding ways how to get in offices. I knew that I didn't care about the city council. I didn't care about the senator. I didn't care about nothing else. I knew that there was some type of repair that needed to be done. And there was some type of defense that had to happen. And I knew that our constitutional rights were being violated, and that this country was in violation of their own statutes. And I knew that the highest elected office, the first black president that we elected, didn't do nothing about it. And I was so angry. I was so distraught. Me just being a regular mixtape rapper at the time, decided, no, I'm going to use this. I don't have nothing, but I'm going to use what God gave me as a way. Every time I rap a lyric, is going to be related to politics, waking black people up in America, getting them ready for this, what I'm about to do. And that's what I did. So back in 2015, I ran. I was the youngest person. The source said that I was the youngest person to legally run. I had just turned 35 on my birthday. That's how bad I wanted it. On my birthday, as soon as I turned 35, I registered with the Federal Elections Committee. And I became a presidential candidate. And I hit the media, I hit the press. I had some key interviews. I was interviewed by the number one station in California, KCBS Radio, by Doug Sovereign. He interviewed me. I was interviewed by KPIX Radio, by KPIX Channel 2 News with Kristen Ayer, one of the star commentators out here, and reparations was on my tongue. Now, you got to understand that at this time, there was nobody talking about reparations. No, not even dancing over the subject, but I was the only one who was keeping it in the media. And because I was the only one who was keeping it in the media, the Democratic Party knew that they had to say something about it, because they was going to look stupid amongst black people. When you have a nobody candidate and who nobody even heard of, talking about he's a mixtape rapper, talking about reparations. So Bernie Sanders had to mention it. And Bernie Sanders got on record and he said it was divisive. Bernie Sanders was using our ancestor Martin Luther King as a cover-up. When Martin Luther King died for reparations, Martin Luther King laid down his life for reparations. It was the reason why in the last 2 years of his life, he made it clear that if we were going to have any type of change, it was going to have to be an economic change. He said we need civil rights, not just civil rights. And he died on that premise. Then you had Bernie Sanders back in 2016 who came out and said that he don't believe in reparations because he thinks it's divisive. But still, he was trying to use Martin Luther King as a cover-up, as a catapult for his campaign. So you got to understand, because you had me out there, you got to understand that in our era, there is no presidential candidate who had reparations as a forefront for his campaign ever. Jesse Jackson was the last person before me who even talked about reparations, but he didn't use it as a main campaign talking point. He was talking about the Rainbow Coalition, money for poor people and all this type of stuff, equality. But he did not have a black agenda. He was not a black agenda priority candidate. We never had that in the history of America, at least not in our era. Probably ever. And I say probably ever because I didn't do enough research to substantiate that. So I'm going to just say probably ever, but I know for a fact in our lifetime, we haven't had it. So fast forward, Donald Trump, he becomes president. Donald Trump becomes president, and never before in the history of America have I seen a presidential candidate be so unapologetic about being a white supremacist. They were kicking people's butt at his press rally. Donald Trump would have speeches while he was campaigning, and black people were getting beat up at his speech rallies. That's why white people love him so much. That's why white supremacists love him so much, because he is unapologetic of who he is. So I said, you know what? I was already like that, but I said, you know what? I'm gonna go harder. This next election, I'm gonna go even harder. I'm gonna prove to my people, to my constituents, that I'm not compromising. I'm not trying to just compromise for white people. That's the problem. We have too many candidates who think that the only way we can win is if we compromise for white people. We gotta dilute our blackness. I wanted to show the people from the get that I was sincere with this, that I am a black agenda priority candidate. This was before anybody was screaming reparations. This was before any movements popped off. This was before it was cool to have a black agenda. I remember talking about reparations and getting laughed at. I remember telling people how I'm going to have a black agenda priority platform and getting laughed at. Today is because of the work that I put in as a candidate, and other people who are on the ground is the reason why the Democratic Party have to at least acknowledge it. But guess what? They want to get into that White House without giving us what we want. And that's why I'm here today.
Okay.
Because we are going to stop that. We are going to have a black agenda priority candidate like never before. We never had it. There's no need for a down ballot. We don't have to down ballot a dang thing, because we have a candidate in Deon D. Jenkins. So I did studying. Because the last thing that I wanted to be is a presidential candidate that's just coming out with theories and ideas and didn't do no studying to back it up. I did calculations. And let me tell you something. You don't have to be, and I want to make this clear, you do not have to be an economist to calculate reparations. You do not have to have a PhD to calculate reparations. You do not have to have many years of schooling and training. Let me tell you something. One of the most brilliant men who I look up to by the name of Malcolm X, Malcolm Little, who changed his name to Malcolm X, got educated in prison. If he could get educated in prison, we could definitely get educated on the outside if you got enough heart. Some of your greatest leaders who ever lived had heart, and your heart is going to get you all of the education that you need. Now, I want to make it clear, you do have to be educated for this. You got to know what you're doing. But you don't need a white man's piece of paper to validate what you know and how to get it and any type of education that's needed in order to get it. All you got to do is know how to find the resources, know how to find the information, be smart enough to calculate numbers and everything. And I'm going to talk about that today. Because what you got to understand is that this country, America, there are 4 elements that catapult American society. And all of the research that I've done, all of the studying, I keep seeing the same thing over and over again. Now, it may look different. There may be different policies and everything, but they all correlate with 4 different types of categories. Defensive structure, capital, land, and the access to capital. Defensive structure is the very first because no nation can thrive without a defensive structure. Because anything you build, you got to be able to protect it. Not only do you got to protect it from outside forces, but you got to be able to enforce the rules that you establish amongst the people who reside. So defensive structure is first. That's why this country spends so much money on defense. Because they understand that. They understand, look, if we want to be a superpower, we got to make sure that most of our resources go on defense. But I'm talking about, but when I talk about defense, I'm talking about for us. Because they have a defensive structure. We need to create a defensive structure, and I'm going to talk about that. So the first is defensive structure, and that incorporates a military, law enforcement, and a judicial system. And these 3 elements right here, there's a famous statement that says the dollar is backed by the bullet. That's so true. Because you don't got to be the smartest dude in the room. You don't got to be the most charismatic dude in the room. You don't got to be the best looking dude in the room, but you got to be the most powerful dude in the room. That's the first one. The second is capital, because every nation has to have an economy. There has to be the flow of currency. And if you do not have a strong economy, your nation will fail. The next element is land, because every nation has to have a territory to reside. And last but not least, the access to capital. Okay? And the access to capital is very important because you got to have ways to access the economy. And there are 7 subcategories dealing with the access to capital. And it's labor, financial investments, grants, loans, inheritances, fundraising, and litigation. Those are the 7 ways how you get money in this country, having access to capital. So not only are these the 4 elements that catapulted America's society, but these are the 4 elements that America used to make us a bottom caste. Facts. And I'm going to talk about that. Because with the defensive structure, America uses its military, its law enforcement and its judicial system to keep black people out. The military, a great example, like I said, with Barack Obama, he called in the National Guard. Okay? Law enforcement, the first police officer was started because he was a slave catcher. That's how police officers started. Was because they said, look, we got to catch these slaves. We got to keep these slaves in check, right? Law enforcement is not just the police, though. You got federal, state, and local agencies and foreign agencies like the CIA, right? And all these agencies were instituted under presidential administrations, okay? Theodore Roosevelt created the FBI because during that time, there was a lot of crime, quote unquote, that was going on, and they were trying to really figure out ways how to gather intelligence to keep from like mafiosos and stuff getting out of control. Okay, so they created the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, for a specific purpose, right? You have, of course, the police, sheriffs, deputies, highway patrol, marshals, all types of law enforcement agencies, right? Then you have a judicial system. Okay, you have a judicial system that's created to make sure that you could funnel people out. Okay, so you set laws in order to capture people who conflict with these laws, and you funnel them out. That's your defensive structure, and all those elements were used. There are studies that show that law enforcement agencies specifically target black people. There are studies that show that the judicial system specifically target black people. Okay? Study shows this. The second element that is being used against us is the economy. Okay? They use their economy to block us out. All right? The next is land. Okay? There is a famous book called Sundown Towns by James Lowen, talking about how black people were driven out of their cities and towns by white terrorist organizations, groups, and just mobs. Your next door neighbor was probably one of them, right? And there was a time during the Reconstruction period when black people were actually getting things, like they were figuring out ways how to acquire land, even though they didn't, really benefit off of the Homestead Acts, but that's another story. But they were building businesses, they had an economy, and a lot of white folks, a lot of people classified as white became jealous of that, and they would get together and they would target these people, and they would tell them, look, you got to be out of here by sundown. If you're not out of here by sundown, we're going to burn everything that you got, and we're going to kill you. And these white people were clicked in, with the sheriffs, law enforcement, the governor, the mayor, politicians, and millions of black people were driven out. There were thousands of these incidents all across the country. In the area I live in, there's a city called Napa, N-A-P-A. The acronym for Napa, and I found out about this in the book. It's called the acronym is No African People Allowed. Okay, and these were areas. So from 1890 all the way to the 1960s, black people were getting driven out, stripped of their property, stripped of their land. Okay. And the last but not least is the access to capital. We are denied loans and grants. There are studies that show this. Already been proven. We're not hired for jobs. We don't have a rich grandmother, a mom, a dad who have capital to pass it down. Okay? We're not in the judicial system where we could just sue people because they're treating us wrong and get the compensation that's needed, because you're probably going to go across a white racist judge. He's probably going to either throw out the case or give you a bad judgment, right? We don't have, our people don't really have enough money to do real big fundraising like that. Like a white person could put up a fundraiser and overnight get $3 million. Black people, we don't have it like that, right? We don't have people financing our investments. Giving us investments for ideas. Like we could have the same idea as a Mark Zuckerberg, but guess what? Mark Zuckerberg gonna have a $600,000 investment, startup capital, is what it's called. Nobody is going to put their money into our ideas, right?
Now, Deon, I was trying to wait, but you just brought this up. I want to get into this capital that you were just speaking of. Running for president is a very, very financially intense. It's very financially intense. With all of that, what you was just stating, and also considering the hatred, for lack of a better term, that we have for each other, how do you plan on creating capital to go across the country in campaigning?
I would disagree with that last statement. I don't think that there's enough hatred. I think that we haven't had a candidate yet that really spoke on our issues and really represented for us. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe that Black people are at a time in their life right now in history where they will get behind a candidate who's speaking their best interest. And not just speaking their best interest, but coming from one of them. And I'm going to talk about that a little later because I have a whole idea how we could make this work and how we could actually win. Because we could actually win this. And I want to talk about that. I first want to really finish my plan and let the people know what I represent, how we want to get it, and everything like that. So I constructed a reparations package entitled Defense Money Land Grants. And that reparations package was basically dealing with the four elements that catapult this nation, right? Dealing with the four elements that I talked about at first, the four elements that I constructed for a reparations package is based on that. Okay, I'm not coming out with nothing, my idea. Well, it's my idea, but this is substantiated by, facts of how this system is operating. It's not just numbers I'm just, taken out of my nose, right? This is studies that I've constructed based on how this economy works, based on how the defensive structure works, based on land that was already promised to us, and access to capital, right? So the first element is defense. And as president of the United States of America, the only absolute power I have is this right here. I have absolute power to make sure that I could establish any type of defensive organization. And how am I planning to do that? It's going to be completely legal by using the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was established giving Black people who descended from slaves, former slaves, American citizenship, something that was denied to us. And previously we had the Dred Scott decision of 1859, which was a Supreme Court case that stated that we were only property, right? So Abraham Lincoln signed an executive order called the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all slaves. However, it was the starting point for what was to soon come. So the only reason why Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, because he was losing the Civil War, and he needed to give black men at the time an incentive to fight for him. So he offered them freedom. He said, look, because he wanted to build his powers up. He wanted to build his man power up, and he knew that he needed more numbers. So he said, look, we got all these millions of slaves out here. Why not arm them? And if they win us this war, we would give them their freedom. So the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an executive order, was written for that purpose. And millions of black slaves were armed. And they won the Civil War against the Confederacy. After the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln was a very, very beloved president, and the people were still in mourning, and they wanted to finish his legacy, right? So what they did, Congress got together and established the 13th Amendment, and that basically abolished slavery, but they left a loophole which stated that if you go to prison, you're still a slave. But the amendment that really sets the standard for what I'm about to do is the 14th Amendment, which gives us equal protection under the law. This means, so when you hear Thomas Jefferson say, all men are created equal, he was talking about white men, white folks. It wasn't until the establishment of the 14th Amendment where this amendment gave us equal access to citizenship. So now all men are created equal. The problem is the law isn't enforced. So the reason why you see a violation of constitutional law is because it's not enforced. So as president, I am going to enforce the law because there was a specific constitutional binding that granted us rights. So there should be a specific enforcement of that binding. It'd be perfectly legal, right? And I plan to create another branch of the military like John F. Kennedy did. The Navy SEALs came into existence because John F. Kennedy signed into law, making the Navy SEALs an elite branch of military, because at the time they needed more intel on foreign affairs and more of a military organization coming off of the beach coastal lines. So he established what's known as today as the Navy SEALs. So when I'm president, I'm going to establish a specific military for black people that's going to protect us not only in this country, but for foreign affairs as well. And a judicial system, a new court system for black people. So we're not going to go through their court system anymore because there's too much evidence showing that it's not being used properly. Okay, when you lock up a young man for 50 years because he stole a pack of bubble gum or because he violated parole, that's white people don't go through that. So that's a violation of these people's constitutional rights, right? When you have Amber Geiger who walk into a man's house and shoot him dead while he's eating ice cream on his couch and get 10 years, okay, it's obvious that we need our own system, all right? So there must be a court system set in place for black people because there are specific enforcements that needs that are needed for us. Just like there was a specific constitutional amendment that was established specifically for us. So it has to be a specific enforcement of the law, all right, which would be perfectly legal and constitutional. The next element is money, and I did a calculation, okay? I calculated that America is worth $1 quadrillion. Now, how did I come up with that number, right? Did I just come out with that number out of my ears, or did I really study and find out how much America was worth? I added up every GDP since 1865, the emancipation year. And I added it up all the way until 2018, which was last year. And I found out that there was a yearly average of $7 trillion a year. I added $7 trillion a year all the way up and got $1 quadrillion. I did another calculation, and I call this the at least factor, which means there is at least these many people. Now, census say that there are that we represent 14% of the population. Okay? However, I added an at least factor that at least 3% are going to be able to prove that they descended from slaves. So with the at least factor, I calculated how many people will actually be able to prove that they descended from slaves, which is 10 million people. How did I get that number? Well, I took 3% of 300 million people, which is the complete sum of people living in this country, which is 300 million. 3% of that is 10 million. If you divide 10 million from 3% of $1 quadrillion, which is $30 trillion, that's every black person getting $3.1 million of a lump sum check. Now, this might have to get dispersed in increments, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, I don't know. We'll find out when we get there, but you get 2 checks. You get one lump sum of $3.1 million and another check that go on an annual basis, and I'm going to talk about that. And the reason why you get a second check that doesn't stop is because this economy was built on our backs, and this economy never stops. America will, as long as America exists, there should be compensation given to black people in America. Now, that check is based on the population size dealing with the yearly gross domestic product, GDP, of $20 trillion with equity